Welcome back to A Leftist Perspective in Black, a space curated specifically for Black people discussing the issues of our time from an anti oppression, left perspective while never leaving out the question of race. I'm Juwanta James Williams and I use he, him pronouns. And thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I want to share a piece of literature that I produced about 13 days ago following the release of New York City Mayor Eric Adams's blueprint in gun violence and all of the rhetoric around trying to end violence in our communities that are rooted in a particularly anti-Black perspective and an anti-Black story. So, uh, Joe Biden was coming to town to support Mayor Adams on ending gun violence in New York City, which we all know he is an architect of the 1994 crime bill. And it just was so particularly violent, the kinds of stories that were being spun connected to the violent murder of two NYPD officers. And 2 weeks before that, the pushing of an Asian woman, Michelle Go, onto a train by a person inside of the subway experiencing homelessness, dealing with mental health care complexities. And I think that so much about that moment was critical that a couple of colleagues and myself organized a direct action, a march, and a vigil to respond. But I wrote a piece that I want to make sure that I document for the record and for this particular show. It's called American Ghosts, Black History, Biden, Adams, and Promised Peril to Black New York. New York City and its political landscape is at the uniquely American nexus of amnesia, violence, and sensationalism. The battlefield of ideas, new and old, where millions of people and billions of dollars offer an example to younger cities of how to respond to the myriad of problems we face. While the families grieve the feelings, while families grieve the killings of two NYPD officers, Jason Rivera and Wilbert Mora, New York City Mayor Eric Adams, a former NYPD officer, is poised to receive the counsel of President Biden, an architect of the notorious 1994 crime law, to respond to the increases in gun violence across the five boroughs. Mayor Adams touts receiving over 70% of the Black vote in New York City, and still the ghosts of American history bubble and seethe at the seams as he promises to resurrect a demonstrably racist, plainclothes crime unit, and perhaps most nefarious, a story of New York, its streets, its culture, its ebb and flow of conflict and peace that is so racist only a Black mayor could tell it. I am a Black, gay, formerly homeless community organizer and the director of organizing of Vocal New York, a statewide community based organization working with people impacted by the 94 crime law, stop and frisk, and the silent but distinctively racist homelessness and overdose crises. I came of age in the aftermath of broken families whose suffering reverberates throughout time, culturally and structurally, where in Black History Month of 2022, 87% of all single adults in New York City shelters are Black or brown. And Black New Yorkers had the highest overdose rates, the sharpest increase since 2020. The leading cause of death for homeless New Yorkers is overdose, and homelessness still fails to make the list of budget and policy priorities for both Adams and Governor Hochul. To date, 43 New Yorkers held in New York State prisons have died from COVID related complications. Candidate Adams was denied support from progressive New Yorkers, not only because he is a former police officer, but because he indicated that he'd legislate from an orientation that disregarded the immediacy of care and compassion needed as response to community violence as we all contended with an uptick amid the economic, social, and psychological toll of the COVID-19 pandemic. We were right to vehemently oppose his election. Last week, Mayor Adams released a blueprint to end gun violence in New York City that leans heavily on policing practices that disproportionately impact Black, brown, and low income New Yorkers. Adams's plan seemingly cobbled together in a vacuum is policing centric, a recall of the Giuliani and Bloomberg era's police first, care second, third, if ever, emphasis that depends upon and breeds fear among New Yorkers. We are afraid of each other. The report fails to apply an analysis concerning how a return or considering how a return to practices some of the worst ended amid the de Blasio administration would affect particularly vulnerable communities like LGBTQ folks, disabled people that use drugs, sex workers, and those experiencing street homelessness. In particular, the plainclothes anti-crime unit has a documented history of extrajudicial killings of black and brown people, most notably 1999's Amadou Diallo. Only a week prior, New Yorkers returning to the subway were horrified by the tragic death of Michelle Go, who was pushed into an oncoming train by a man experiencing mental health complexities. Go was the latest in a string of anti-Asian assaults as New Yorkers grapple with a 300% increase since former President Trump's coupling of Asian communities with COVID. Mayor Adams and Governor Hochul together championed a plan to increase NYPD presence underground alongside units of mental health care professionals and outreach workers, while committing to no meaningful plan to rapidly rehouse homeless New Yorkers or funding for a popular Section 8 like housing voucher program being considered in the state legislature. That's Senate Bill 2804B and Assembly Bill 370B. Governor Hochul also allowed the eviction moratorium to expire despite housing advocates' concern that it could lead to an increase in homelessness, adding to a crisis that rivals that of the Great Depression. What will happen to the tens of thousands of black and brown New Yorkers that are behind on their rent? Of course, I don't believe that Mayor Adams's ire is born of a racist heart. Regardless of politics or profession, he is still a black man. I want to believe that Mayor Adams is interested in the thriving of black communities across New York City. However, the phantoms of a fundamentally racist story are core to his early attempts to generate and maintain safety in New York City. He neglects that the formation of most institutions like the NYPD and arguably the fundamental structures of the American pursuit of democracy are shaped, morphed, and persist in tandem with the struggle of Black Americans catching hell and demanding better conditions and a shot at the American dream. For so many of us, it's a waking nightmare, especially those that live in communities of color slated to have an elevated police presence. On that Thursday, as President Biden joined Mayor Adams to discuss bringing law and order to New York City, I helped organize a Black-led community vigil for those lost to gun violence. We gathered at the Harlem Harriet Tubman Memorial, a woman whose story defies the confines of her time because of her relentless, subversive demands and defiant claim towards liberation for herself, her people, and ultimately all people. The ghosts of Black ancestors, Tubman, Douglas, Baker, King, Baldwin, Chisholm, Morrison, Hooks, compel us to gather and imagine a new way forward to challenge again the historic specter of a country that hates those of us that make it what it is. In short, Adams doesn't need to call on Biden to solve New York's problems. He can look no further than his own backyard. The very organizations and communities that called to defund the police in 2020 amid a popular uprising that dwarfed most uprisings in American history have been offering solutions that address the root causes of violence in our communities for years. Instead of being concerned about the palatability of the phrase or the political threat of being associated with an intentionally misconstrued concept, the mayor should take into account the evidence-based call to reorient how the city distributes resources. He should reduce the scope, influence, and our reliance on the NYPD, focus on the concurring crises that produce the conditions that foster suffering and its inherent byproduct, violence, which includes gun violence. The administration has an opportunity to meet the challenge of our time. They can align themselves with a lesser past, or they can use the power of Biden's presence and office to tell a new story about New York City, and set a new standard of care and compassion in our public safety policy. The mayor has community guidance. Vocal New York released the A Caring and Compassionate New Deal report in March of 2021, calling for a restructuring of New York City agencies to better meet the needs of those experiencing homelessness, substance use disorders, and mental health complexities. The report was used as a framing for a caring and compassionate mayoral forum where Mayor Adams sparred with the other leading mayoral candidates at the time. That video of a caring and compassionate mayoral forum can be found on YouTube. Thank you so much.